Let's talk about sex.
You might think that it's XXX, but maybe to me it's PG.
Strange date. I mean, like I flew to Chicago and we had a therapy
And I'm like,
session.
I have a therapy session.
The best sex of their lives, 55 and older. And I said, woohoo!
Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Croley, and welcome to another episode of Beauty and the Brain. Let's talk about sex. So we have a great topic today, and we have a wonderful guest here with us, a friend of ours for a while. We have with us Sheri Hendon. So welcome, Sheri.
Thank you.
We're excited to have you here. I'm Jerry Drinkard, family nurse practitioner, and together Chris and I own Skin and Tonic, a med spa in Pace, Florida. And we're very fortunate to have Sheri here. You've been a friend of ours and patient over at the clinic, and we're just happy to have you here.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Well, today we have a really exciting podcast, and I think so many people are interested in this topic, and especially to get some of your insight on this. So many of you guys know that are listening to us that we provide sexual health services at Skin and Tonic. And so Jerry and I have kind of been doing this for a while now. So we started just to do some PRP facials, things with plasma therapies, and part of the class that we took included a portion where we learned to do O shots and P shots. And this was, right after these procedures kind of first got their trademark by Dr. Runnels. And but at that time, we both said, no, we're not doing anything below the neck. Yeah. We don't want
forever. We treat from nipples up.
Yeah, we don't want to talk about it. That's not our issue. I don't even remember exactly now. I think a patient had some nipple sensitivity issues after a breast surgery, and she kind of convinced us to do PRP. She had read something about it, knew we were doing those procedures. And then from that, it kind of grew, and we started, treating some males and females with P shots and O shots, and saw the great results that they had and the impact it had on their life. And the more we kind of researched this field and the more patients that we treated, for us, it was something that was really different than the other aesthetics we were providing. So it wasn't just filling a wrinkle or a line. We really were able to help them in a way that kind of positively changed their outlook on life in general. But one of the things that we still struggle with, and this is where I think it's so important to have your expertise and people like you, is we don't have the training or the expertise to do the psychological part that goes along with this. We can help you with the physical problems, but we don't have all the expertise. And so do you want to take a few minutes and tell us about yourself and your background and how you got into this?
Sure. So my name is Sheri Hendon. I am an independent clinical social worker, and then I specialize in the treatment of trauma, and I'm also a certified sex addiction therapist. And so my first job out of college, I ended up at a group home for teenage boys that had landed in foster care because of some of their sexual behaviors. So that was kind of, being thrown into the fire there. And then the next job that I got was in child welfare at the Department of Human Resources in a small town in Alabama. And so that was really being thrown in the deep end of the pool. I saw everything there that could be done to a child. And I stayed there for about 5 years. And they had a great incentive program back then where you could go and get your master's in social work. And so I did that. I'll never forget my first day at DHR. They had me shadow a lady that had her master's in social work, and she held a difficult meeting with a birth family and talked about, child abuse and neglect, and she ran that meeting. And I said, I want to be like her when I grow up. So here I am.
Here you are.
We all have those people in our lives, right? It's a great thing that they form such powerful impressions and memories.
Yes.
So now you do a lot of work, not just on, sex addiction, sex therapy, but a lot of other sorts of trauma and PTSD as well, right?
Yes. PTSD is definitely my thing. Probably the most common thing that I work with people is for their anxiety. Anxiety is probably the most common mental illness, and there's, lots of different causes, but it can really impact someone's quality of life.
Yeah. I don't think I realized the impact that PTSD and anxiety had on sex or intimacy, I should say, until we started doing more sexual health at the clinic. And I was seeing young guys that, appear healthy and appear well, and everything seemed like it should be okay, and they were coming and they were having issues. And a lot of it was related to some type of PTSD. And, we'll let you elaborate on this a little bit. The anxiety around performance can be devastating if it doesn't perform. And so, it's pretty amazing the impact that can have on someone's overall well-being. And so when you talk about PTSD, do you think it's necessarily related to a trauma or to an incident, or can it be related to like PTSD related to sex itself or performance anxiety?
All of the above. Our medical system has done a really good job kind of separating out the body from the mind, but they're connected. So anything that affects us physically will also affect us mentally. But I will never forget one day when you and I were talking and you said women can sexually perform being disordered, but men, not necessarily the case. And, I knew that, but to have it broken down for me like that, I was like, wow, that's really true. And so much of, a person's self-concept and, who they feel that they show up in their family can be related to all of those things.
Well, it's just a big part of overall well-being and who we are. And I think that when you aren't able to meet not even someone else's expectations, but your own expectations. I think we hold ourselves to a lot of times higher standards than someone else does. And so not being able to meet our own expectations, there's a whole different class of anxiety, I think, just that we put on ourselves, In my opinion, like a lot of times, your lover or your companion or whatever, they're a lot more forgiving towards us than we are.
Yes.
How do you think like PTSD impacts what we're seeing at the clinic, like our population?
Yeah, I think that it, like you said, it's interesting because you can't separate a lot of these things, and I think there is some sort of stress-related disorder. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know all the actual diagnosis, but we see these guys that come in and they had a drunk night or something, happened, and they couldn't perform it the way they wanted to. So they had some sort of erectile problem in a particular instance, and then they get so stressed about that perpetuates the problem even further. We've had people that come in and tell us we're so anxious and so nervous because they worry about anticipating sex, and they try to sneak and take Viagra or whatever their crutch is, and they don't want their partner finding out that they're taking it. That alone causes stress about that actual, the act of sex. And so, I think it's an interesting question in the way that you phrase it, because I think we think about some of these incidents like you have to undergo some sort of abuse or be involved in some sort of, car crash or some big trauma to have this. But I think just the physical act of not being able to perform at the time that you want is in and of itself a stressful situation that can then perpetuate this problem.
Yes. And so I was going to kind of go down a little bit of a rabbit hole and say, like, part of my role as a certified sex addiction therapist is to help people get in a place where they can be intimate. Like, unfortunately, intimacy has gotten to where it means sex, but that's not what intimacy really is. Intimacy is being open, genuine, and honest on purpose to deepen the relationship. So being able to communicate with your partner about even having a problem is sometimes a greater act of intimacy than even having sex itself. But that being able to be intimate is impaired by trauma, because at a fundamental level, trauma impairs our ability to trust even ourselves.
And that's interesting because, we've also talked a bit about this. We have a really it seems like a disproportionate number of military patients that we see, and it's men and women, but obviously we have a lot of guys that have come in for actual treatments for erectile dysfunction of some sort, and they've been in a situation, and I guess it really does kind of factor into what you're saying, like if they've been in some sort of trauma or war situation or things that where they're not in control, there's other things that impact them, then it makes it very hard to trust even their own feelings, much less that of their spouse, and to share those things.
I never put those two together until the day you and I were talking, and we were talking about PTSD, and I was talking about my PTSD military patients in particular the day we were talking, and I was like, I just didn't understand, how does PTSD cause sexual performance issues? And you were like, sex is about trust. And especially for guys performing, you have to be able to trust to perform, unless you do have some type of, assistance, I guess, Viagra, but we have a lot of people as well that those crutches don't help, And so I think being able to recreate that trust, or reestablish that development of trust within someone's self is important. And one of the questions that I always ask my patients the first time I interview them is, are you able to masturbate?
Yes.
And I think that, when someone's able to masturbate, but they have a sexual performance issue, that tells us a lot about what we're dealing with. And sometimes that's when they need someone like you, someone more than me. Like that's over my head. And so, but it seems like such a simple question, and such a question that's probably not necessarily what you expect to hear when you come to an aesthetic clinic. And so do you want to talk a little about that and how that can tell us a lot about what we're dealing with?
Yes. So one thing I did want to note is, the first thing that we need for any kind of healing from these kind of issues is a feeling of safety. And I think that's one of the reasons why y'all have been so successful, is you have created that feeling of safety for patients, and then you found ways to bring it up, to talk about it. And that goes, just such a long, long way. The thing about trauma, we always are able to recognize it because it keeps us stuck. So if you encounter someone who is, stuck, say, in a sexual situation, that would be an indicator to kind of explore a little deeper, or maybe invite them to see, somebody like me. What I tell patients the first time that I see them is I say, I worked in child welfare for 5 years. I've been a certified sex addiction therapist for several years. I don't know if I can be shocked anymore. So the stuff that you might be bringing, you might think that it's XXX, but maybe to me it's PG. So, whatever you want to talk about, that's what we're here to work on. But I wanted to bring up the technique that I use to reprocess trauma memories. It's called EMDR, and that stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprogramming. And what's beautiful about that technique is you're not in therapy forever. When I get a new patient that has, trouble with anxiety, or I guess really everybody that I see now, is I teach them self-soothing techniques, again, to help them learn to create that sense of safety within themselves, for themselves. Now, I'm not against medicine, but, medicine runs out sometimes. So making sure that people are good at soothing themselves, learning how to do it on the fly, independently, that's the very first thing that I do. And then we work towards EMDR. And so one of the beautiful things about EMDR is you don't really discuss any details of the trauma. You're just thinking about it. Because a lot of the patients that I work with have had, childhood sexual abuse. Nobody wants to talk about that, but that's where the healing is that they need. So that's why EMDR is so fantastic. And, I enjoy talking with you about the veterans. I used to work in an inpatient substance abuse facility with veterans that, had PTSD and substance abuse problems. And the kind of experiences that they found themselves in are sometimes unimaginable, for people like us. And they just had to do their best. And those kinds of situations can't always be replicated, back in the States. And so, just trying to deal with that. And, the hardest thing for a lot of them is coming back to their life, or figuring out what their life is now. And instead of like looking around the trauma all the time, learning to put it away and get it out when you want to, instead of being, besieged by it every so often and not being able to enjoy. And, something I noticed with PTSD as well is it takes away, for a lot of people, our ability to kind of be spontaneous or take risks or kind of do things on the fly. It kind of keeps people small.
Yeah. Like while you were talking about that, I was thinking like with PTSD, we talked about the PTSD impact in sexual performance and how someone can't perform. But I would think there could also be the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where PTSD could create like a hypersexuality, if you want to say that, or a sexual addiction, which is one of your specialties. And so, like, how do you deal with that? I mean, they're something that I think are caused by the same thing, but they're two completely different
presentations. Yes. And so people that have trauma, they have to have usually some kind of compulsive or addictive behavior to medicate the pain of that trauma. And I love to remind people, we don't get to pick what that is. Like, it's just kind of based on our, biology. For some people, that's food. For some people, it's gambling. For some people, it's benzodiazepines. Like, we don't get to pick. But realizing that behavior has a purpose. And that's why, like, with a lot of the quick fixes, take this pill or what have you, I'm not as big of a fan of those things, because there's always an underlying behavior. And so just like I remember when I was working in a inpatient facility, we got a whole bunch of ladies that had gastric bypass, a year, 6 months before that, and they had never had any problems with substance abuse. But when they could not use their food addiction anymore, then they became substance abuse addicts. So that's why I'm a big supporter of, people addressing those underlying needs, is because it can just create another problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. And it kind of also brings up another point that we started to talk about a little bit before we went on air for this episode. But, how do you determine what is the deciding factor between a sex addiction or something that may be a response to trauma versus just a normal, healthy, active sex life?
That is a fantastic question, and I will answer that as Patrick Carnes does. He's kind of like the grandfather of sex addiction treatment. And what he says is, if someone's sexual behavior is violating their own moral standards, their own values, you kind of see that double life in really extreme forms. But, lots of times I'll invite people to think about, is that sexual behavior causing problems at work? Is it causing problems at home, in the relationship, with the law? People that struggle with addiction, they will do things even though they know better. And so when you look at those patterns over time, that's when you're like, there may be a sex addiction.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I really don't think people think of it that way. But it's like, yeah, people can have a normal, healthy, active sex life. It doesn't have to be an addiction. So what advice would you give, to me or to Jerry or providers like us that are out there listening, to help break down the barriers to get their patients to consider therapy? I know that, you and I may have talked about this in the past. We're very open about our past and huge believers in therapy. It definitely, I think, changed the trajectory of our relationship. Jerry thought that I was a little bit crazy because with my prior relationship, we went to a therapist at the end of an 11-year relationship, and we expected this individual to fix problems that had been present for years. And it's like, I didn't think about it at the time. It's like, that's what you do. You're going through trouble, you go to the therapist. And but then, kind of in hindsight, I looked at it and I'm like, that was really crazy. Like, how do we expect one person to undo all of those years of problems in this short period of time? And so then fast forward a bit, and Jerry and I, we're dating, and we're considering him moving to Chicago. And I said, I think we need to go to therapy from the beginning. I don't know if it's the right thing, but it certainly didn't work the other way around where we went at the end. So I think that we need to try something different. And he thought, yeah, whatever. I'm sure he was just appeasing me at the moment. Like, But what he didn't realize is he moved.
Like a strange date. I mean, like I flew to Chicago and we had a therapy
And I'm like,
session.
I have a therapy session. And so, Vimy, if you're out there listening to us, she's, was our therapist for a long time when we were there. And I can't, tell you how much help that she provided for both of us. But we did start going right away, and we went weekly, and it changed really the trajectory of our relationship. And we were able to both work individually and figure out what were things that were prior traumas that we had experienced, what were triggers, what way did we need to communicate with each other to make a strong foundation for our relationship. But literally that was because I had been through a prior bad situation where I thought therapy doesn't work. So I know a lot of people think that it's useless. It's just talking, and I don't need to go just talk to someone. And so I try to share our personal story as many times as I can to let people know that, look, you can get through all this, and it was incredibly beneficial to us. But I still struggle with trying to get patients who think it's just nothing more than talking to understand the benefit of going to see a professional.
Something I like to ask people is, do you want the kind of relationships that you were around when you were a child? Is that the kind of marriage that you want? Is that the kind of relationship you want? Because all of that is kind of laid down. It's almost like the pattern, the default. So if you don't want that, then you're going to have to do some work to have something different.
I did think he was crazy. In hindsight, it worked for us. Here we are like many, many years later, but it really did kind of guide us on, because I think most relationships are good when they start because it's fun. And we had a long distance relationship, and I told Chris, it was almost like a bachelor relationship, because we would meet at conferences, and it would be like really fun locations, and we'd eat at the best of restaurants, or we would go hot air ballooning, or we would do, it was always fun things. It was like destination dates because we lived so far apart. Or I'd go to Chicago and we'd go see a show or a swanky restaurant. But I'm like, how do we keep it like this? And 15 years later, I'm not saying that it's been easy every step, but my communication was really bad because my family, we don't talk. Right. We don't talk about it. And Chris's family is very much like that, but somehow he broke that barrier.
Both of our families are probably dying that we're talking about this on a podcast right now. They're probably like, oh my God.
I'll tag you, Mama. But it really has been something that's been beneficial, and not just in our relationship, I think, but in all of my other relationships too, was having that professional that helped to guide us through, or especially me personally, to help to guide me to be like, it's okay to say something that someone doesn't like, or it's okay for you to feel uncomfortable to say something. And then once it's out, it's almost like a breath of fresh air. It's like, that felt so good to get that done. And so and I think a lot of the people that are suffering from some of the sexual issues or the addictions and that sort of thing, because sex is taboo. Even the topic of this is gonna get more likes than weight loss. It really will, because it's taboo. People want to know about it and they want to talk about it, but they don't really want to talk about it. And so I think removing the taboo from sex is so important. And I think that's what people like you kind of guide people like us and people like them, that everyone that's listening, So.
Do you have any advice on how to spice up relationships, spice up the bedroom for people who have been in relationships? We had a patient ask us that yesterday, right?
I told a patient yesterday that we were doing this podcast today, and he's been in a long-term relationship, 15-year relationship, and he's like, ask her how to keep it spicy.
How to keep it spicy after 15 years.
Yes. So I just got back from the symposium, the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, and there was a great topic there. And I wrote the name down because I knew I wanted to share it with y'all. So it's Peggy Kleinplatz, and it's Magnificent Sex. That's her book, Lessons from Extraordinary Lovers. And so it's so funny, when you go to conferences and what's the one thing, that you remember? I remember her saying that of all of the people that she studied, people said that they had the best sex of their lives 55 and older. And I said, woohoo!
Sherry's looks are misleading because you'd think that she wasn't anywhere near the 55 and older, and you're not there, but we're approaching. So, yeah, who to us, all of us.
Yes, absolutely. And so we're all wired for that intimacy. And so if we don't have it, we're always wanting it. But if something has happened where we're not able to trust, then we can't have it. So really that intimacy, that connectedness, that's truly the key to great sex.
All right.
It seems so simple.
I know.
It seems so simple.
so simple.
So simple, but so hard to achieve.
Yeah.
Sounds like we need, to make sure we have a fresh stack of your cards in the office because we need to send a lot more people your way.
Absolutely.
Well, good relationships take work, just like you were describing. I think you would be hard-pressed to find anybody that has a good relationship that would not tell you, yes, there's been some rough spots. Yes, we needed to do some work.
Yeah, and I think that's whether like in the bedroom or at work. Good relationships, period, take work and communication, and those are things that you have to be willing to do, and it's not always things that are easy to do.
Now, when you start working with some of these patients, obviously it's going to be very different based on the situation of that individual. But is this an exceedingly long process for people to see results? So if they're saying, I want to go to therapy, but it's just going to take me a year before I see results. I mean, what do you tell people when they ask you those sorts of questions?
I always ask them what their goals are. It could be that they just want to see improvement in one area of their life. And if that's all that they want, then that's fine. But if we're talking about like sex addiction recovery, we're usually not just talking about the individual. We're talking about their family, especially their spouse, their children. So then we can be talking about, a 2 to 4 year process where everybody's involved. But I don't think I've ever found anybody that hasn't, gone on that path that has not said that it was completely worth it.
Yeah, and I think that's good for people to know that there is hope regardless of how long you have to work at it. I was thinking more specifically for some of our patients that are having trouble with trust issues in general. And, I guess the message that I want to get out there is that this is not something that will take you years. It may take years to fully recover, to learn how to deal with these things, but at least in my experience and from the limited discussions we've had, it's something that people can start seeing results from sooner. It's something that it's a work in progress, and you're not gonna go in every session and every bit of work that you put into it, you're gonna get results from that. It may not be, where you don't have to go anymore. It's not a one and done sort of thing, but you're going to see continual improvement, and you're going to, not have to do that for years. Because I think that's the other barrier. People think if I have to go every week for a year before I see any results, I really don't have time. I don't, have the money, whatever their barriers are. But I think time is a big thing because people have this conception, preconceived notion that it's going to take years to see any result, and where years may be necessary to fully resolve an issue, I think you see things sooner than that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh no, you're right. And I was actually thinking about some patients that I've treated in the past. One that was coming to mind was a young man that actually had to shoot and kill somebody to save his own life. So, and he came to see me for that because it had just, taken over his life. He could barely work. He couldn't sleep. His marriage was about to fall apart. So we did, I think we ended up doing 3 EMDR sessions on that one event. And the amount of progress that he made was amazing. So we're talking about maybe we can do EMDR every 2 weeks. So we're talking about, bi-weekly sessions for a few months, and he's seeing massive improvement.
And that's amazing. And like I said, that's what one of the messages I want to get out there is when we say, go and get help, go see a therapist, a psychologist, somebody with expertise, I think so many people brush it off because of that time, but it's well worth the effort, and it's not years to start seeing results. You can start really, developing those relationships much sooner than that. Any final thoughts that you have, Jerry? Or?
I'm just glad that we have you as a resource, and as a friend certainly, but as a resource, because like you and I have talked on several occasions about different things that I have come up with patients that I'm not really sure how to handle, and so I just appreciate it that you're available for us and available, and we'll put your contact information and the links, and just like happy to have you as part of us.
Any final thoughts that you want to?
I just wanted to share how happy I was, especially like the P wave. That's so exciting, that treatment for, men that maybe not exactly sure, what's going on with some performance problems, but something that's available. Hope.
Yeah, there's hope, and it's not invasive. It doesn't have to hurt. So.
Right.
The one thing I do want to kind of like jump back a little bit, and before we close this out, is we focused a lot on men, and I think but it's something that definitely doesn't spare women, and maybe not always for the same reasons. And we did touch on that, like mechanically they can do things. It's not like a guy who may not be able to, but oftentimes women have their own sorts of issues, and I didn't realize to the extent of that until, really recently, the more that we have women ask us about these problems. And I think theirs is, like I said, it's a different population that we're seeing. It's more like hormonal changes, but sex becomes painful. So it's not that they can't do it, but they don't enjoy it because it hurts. And, definitely we want all of our women listeners to know that there's options for them as well. So, we have some treatments in the clinic that can help, especially with perimenopausal dryness, vaginal atrophy, some of these things that can cause it uncomfortable. And we certainly have resources available referring patients out for any kind of psychological help that they need, but also for any urogynecological evaluations they need from those appropriate professionals to make sure that there's not something more serious going on. But we have a lot of options for women too. It's not just men that have these problems.
Yep, because we got to be in tip-top shape for that great sex that's coming for all of us at 55.
55, that's a magic number. So, all right, well, thank you so much, Sheri, for being here with us today. We really appreciate it. All of you that tuned in to listen, we hope you've learned a lot from this episode. We're going to put all the links and resources for things that we talked about throughout this episode, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
See you soon.